Okay, just testing the microphone for the people online. Can you hear me? Yeah,
Yes.
thanks. And if you have questions, you can give me a sound in the headphones, and I'll get to the chat because I'm not gonna see when the chat, what happens in the chat. Okay, we should all start. Welcome back after your very short break. For those of you who are here, it's super exciting. Some of you are basically mostly seen online, so this is great. What we're doing today is we're going to have advanced cognitive modeling. You might ask why advanced? Well, when we had to design the master, it sounded really good with advanced. But you'll see how it builds on top of things that you've learned. First, since some of you haven't met me before, especially people online, this is basically me most of the time. My kids are bigger now, a few years bigger. They're still like that. I have been trained not as a cognitive scientist, but as a semiotician, that is, as somebody who cares about how things make sense and tries to figure out common methods that can be used to analyze things as different as your experience of tasting a wine, a movie, Indo-European literature, and so on and so forth, which really fascinated me at the time because it gave me a method that could allow me to talk about things I knew shit about. And it really left me a big focus on trying to understand in which ways we humans mostly make sense together through cognitive artifacts, expressions like language, and things like that. And so these days, I identify mostly as a cognitive scientist to the point that I persuaded Aarhus University to give me an associate professorship in cognitive science. That worked. Take it until you make it. Uh, my everyday life is very different from the stuff that I was doing at that time because I mostly sit working with computational or statistical models with lots of empirical data. These days, it's mostly observational because I work a lot on child caregiver interactions, but sometimes even experimental. And I still take a lot of what I learned from my past, dark past as a semiotician, into the way I do cognitive science. And I'm going to be speaking very little, but a bit about that because it might make it more clear for you where I come from and why I focus on the things that I will force you to focus on for the rest of the semester. The first is that cognition is collective meaning making, the way we make decisions, the way we speak, the way even we perceive the world are actually deeply shaped by the social interactions that we are within, that we have been through, and by the cultural evolution that shapes our cognition and environment. And that's where trying to model these sort of dynamics brought me to statistics because there are very complex interdependencies at work, which cannot, in most cases, be tackled in any satisfactory way with an ANOVA or even just a general linear model with repeated measures. We need to deal with more complex stuff. The second is that models, like the computational models that we will be dealing with, like the statistical models that you've been using, like the boxes and arrows stuff that you did in Intro to Cog Sci, are semiotic artifacts. They are meaningful things that we put out in the world and that change the way we think. And so we will see computational modeling not as much as here in the world, there are these kind of models that clever people have developed, and here is how you use them. But we will learn how do we think in a different way through models. The last point is that I see, well, given I studied collective meaning making, as I do science, as I do modeling, I cannot but seeing that as a practice through which we make sense together And that is a practice is something that's made by habits that we took from people who were doing these things before us and with blind spots, with things that we end up doing just because that's the way you do things. That's science, right? And so I will here and there try to really push this critical angle that the way that we use these concepts, the way that we use computational modeling techniques, the way that we use the tools that we're going to learn how to use, they're nothing but practices, ways of making sense of the word, ways of building knowledge about cognition. And as any practice, human practice, they have blind spots and they're based on things that we hardly question. There's going to be a lot of programming, I promise. But yeah. So now you know a bit about me and which kind of crazy perspective I tend to bring to the things I teach and do. But I just would like to have another round of names because I don't always have a name associated with a face. And if you have some expectation about the course that you want to just express, I'll take some notes, but you don't need to. Just if you have something that you would like to bring up at this stage. We start from you. Yes. Okay, yep. Even best friends forever. Cool. Clara. Yes. Yes. Thank you. Things have been underlying with my not very like yes. I guess that's also model thinking. Yeah. Fun. Lots of new best friends. Actually, let's put it on top, right? Yes. Can I ask very little, like what scares you about the course? Or what you think will be challenging to survive? Okay, yep. And I have slides on that, but I just want to reassure you that this is a course that's really into what we used to call deep learning before deep learning. Is actually understanding what are the tools that we use. I don't really care how many models we get through. I really want you to understand the techniques. So there's going to be space for people who want to do advanced things, but there is a very clear path on understanding things step by step. Yes. Cool. Andreas, yeah. Yes. Yes. So it's like, yeah, well, creative modeling. Yes. Yes. Yeah. So for people online, actually, I should remember to repeat the main things, but the expectation here was stand, standing stand. Yes.
So you can call me back. And one thing that I would like to better is say when we decide that we want to model something, we know that our data is like this, and how can we jump from that to just kind of having an intuition about, oh, I have to model it in this space because I know that I have to convert it to this and I want to use this main function. Just kind of getting into back more of these like
Yeah. So for the people online, this was how do we go from our intuition about the data and the data generating process to the actual model? How do we build the right links that turn one kind of scale into another that's easier to model or that respects the criteria that are set in the data and so on and so forth? Yes. Thanks. Yes. Okay. People of the Zoom, this was about how do we even install Stan? Yes. Mhm. Least amount of mental breakdown. Yes. Yes. You. Cool. Good enough. Good. Yeah. Ooh, I'm actually streaming presenter mode. Thanks for people letting me know there. Okay. Better? Okay. Uh, any of you from the Zoom world wants to add something? We're not going to do introductions because we're not seeing your faces here, but if you have points about expectations. Ingrid, who's a visiting PhD student from DTU and who will join us in person from next time, says Bayesian modeling, which is great. Okay. So what do we do today? Today, we're going to discuss what we're going to learn and why. Move that thingy away. We're going to be discussing what is cognitive modeling and why should we even care, just to sort of get everybody on board. And why are we doing cognitive modeling within a Bayesian workflow, which is not the only way of building models of cognition. And we will then see how what I want you to learn, and the study board agrees, is embodied by the exam form and how the course is structured in a way to bring you to the exam, learning what we think is important for you to learn and find. And hopefully that will not cover the whole day, because then we're going to do a Bayesian recap and we're going to discuss some of the hiccups and uh, doubts that you have lingering, so that they can also be further integrated as we go through the actual modeling techniques in the next weeks. Right. So the course is a course about how to think through, formalize, and validate models of cognitive processes. And I should have said computational, but I said formalized, so that should be good enough. So you have some knowledge about cognitive processes, or at least you think you have some knowledge about cognitive science and how we think and the things that are underlying our behavior. What we're going to do throughout this course is go through several painful experiences of trying to formalize these ideas into something that can be run as a computer program. And check what are the implications of these formalizations and whether they even make sense. So, in a sense, a lot of your education has been about your understanding of cognitive processes, right? And therefore, you learned ways of investigating them using experiments and using statistical modeling, right? You've gone through at least 4 methods courses. You've written several papers, right? What is different in these courses? Wasn't experimental design and statistical modeling exactly a way of formalizing inferences about cognitive processes? Partially rhetorical question, partially true, right? Especially if you talk to people who are only experimenters or to people who are only computational modelers, that gap is not clear. Right? How do we use experiments to investigate cognitive processes? Yes. Yes. And what are you using experimental design for? Right? Why are you so careful in designing the experiment? Yes. So for instance, and I'm making the example up on the spot, so it might be crappy, but we have these ideas that memory follows an exponential decay, right? So it decays pretty fast at the start, but then it reaches a certain level and it decays very slowly, right? So what we could do is we could create an experiment in which we test people at carefully timed intervals in order to evaluate, as the time increases without a test, how much has their memory decayed. So what the experimental design allows us to do is to actually do a formalization of our model. These gaps from the presentation of the stimuli are an adequate representation of the time scale at which memory decays and captures the curve in a meaningful way. This means that when we get the data, we can run a t-test or an ANOVA or a repeated measure mixed effect models, right? And given that we've been clever with our experiment, if theory A is true, we should see these kind of result. If theory B is true and no other theories are possible, we should see this kind of results, right? How do you think that actually formalizing in a computer program, in a mathematical formula, in a stand model, the exponential decay of memory is going to help you? And sorry, I like to get discussions in class, right? I know that you're not always ready to come up with answers, and that's fine. I'm just sort of setting up the pace. Yes.
setting point.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And so, for instance, what can we do with that we couldn't do with the experiment? Prior belief. Okay, yeah, we could take previous information from previous experiments into account to get more precise estimates of how things are decay. Yes, great. Yeah. Yes. Exactly. Yeah, we can make better inferences about what happens when we're not measuring, if our model is meaningful. Another thing that sorry. We could simulate data, see the implications of the model, and actually run the experiment in advance and get very precise estimates if our model is true of what we would expect to see and of whether we would be able to assess it with the experimental design that we have. Great. These are all great points. Malte?
If you build a computational model that has psychological implications or the model process, then you actually have something that you can expand if you want to try something else with the theory, or you can correlate with a neural measure. And so on. And then you have direct access to different parts of the theory that you can.
Yes, this is a great point. So for instance, in this crappy example that I just made up, and there's going to be better example in slide later and throughout the course, right? Exponential decay of memory assumes that you've learned the information that you're exposed to. But people learn differently, right? To start with. So we could implement a mathematical formula that has both the learning part and the exponential decay, fit it to the data, and get separate estimates for learning and for decay, right? Which then we could, so that in itself could be interesting, especially if we're investigating cognitive impairment, right? One of the projects I'm involved now is studying how certain kinds of drugs, antipsychotic drugs involved in ADHD, and drugs involved in treatment of Parkinson might create gambling addiction. And when you have somebody gambling away lots of money, there are several components, according to the theory of cognitive science, that could be causing the gambling problem. One could be simply that people are not able to learn the probability of reward. Learning problem. And there you can have a reinforcement learning kind of component. Another could be that their risk aversion changes. And here we say that if I tell Pernille, you can have 50 krona to buy an ice cream for sure, or you can have 50% chance of getting 100 krona or zero, right? Mathematically, it's the same, but a risk-averse person will prefer strongly the 50, and a risk-seeking person will strongly prefer the chance. Right? That might change. Or another component that might change, I think you've done something of that of decision making, or at the very least in introduction to cognitive science, is the loss aversion. That is, earning 50 krona might not have the same symmetric value as losing 50 krona. Right? Many people will think that it's much worse to lose 50 krona than it is good to earn 50 krona, right? So by formalizing these things, even if the experiment can help us discriminate things a bit, we get a much more precise grasp of what our theory would say, and if the theory is in any way useful, estimates of these different components and see where the problem is, right? Does this make sense? Now it's the big picture, right? Another point that we can do with cognitive modeling is that we don't always have the possibility to carefully do experiments, right? Sometimes we have very interesting naturalistic data, which there is great value in modeling and understanding those. Keeping on the gambling example, for instance, Josh, who you well know, was involved in a startup that offered to gambling companies, casinos, and the like, uh, a screener for their customers as they were using the casino or as they were going through a screener. The cognitive modeling underlying that could actually infer their risk aversion, their loss aversion, their learning mechanisms, and according to some decisions not made by Josh, but by people who understand the topic, raise red flags, right? Warn people that maybe there is a problem with their gambling. These can be done even without carefully assessing things with an experiment. Does that make sense? Another example is I work a lot with psychiatric patients who undergo a bunch of very heavy standardized cognitive testing, which they hate because if they're at the hospital, they're usually failing in things. And so they have to go through these quite hard tasks and get very frustrated when they want to talk about their problems or be left alone. These data is there. If we can get more information from the data that has been designed, sometimes with different purposes, that is also a very good result, right? I think I've anticipated some stuff, but that's all good. I like to adjust according to the lecture. So now I'm going to read a long text, which explains a bit more how we can use cognitive modeling in our way of doing science. I think it's a beautiful setup. It's from a book called Models of the Mind by Grace Lindsay, I think. And it says the web weaving spider Cyclosa octotuberculata inhabits several locations in and around Japan, about the size of a fingernail and covered in camouflaging specks of black, white, and brown. This arachnid, this spider, is a crafty predator. Sitting at the hub of its expertly built web, it waits to feel vibrations in the web's threads that are caused by struggling prey. As soon as the spider senses this movement, it storms off in the direction of the signal, ready to devour its catch. Sometimes prey is more commonly found in one location on the web than others. Smart predators know to keep track of these regularities and exploit them. Certain birds, for example, will recall where food has been abundant recently and return to those areas at a later time. Cyclosa octotuberculata does something similar, but not identical. Rather than remembering the locations that have fared well, that is, rather than storing these locations in its mind and letting them influence its future attention, the spider literally weaves this information into its web. In particular, it uses its legs to tug on the specific silk threads from which prey has recently been detected, making them tighter. The tightened threads are more sensitive to vibrations, making future prey easier to detect on them. There's a higher base rate, lower risk of false positives. You can make your thing more sensitive. Making these alterations to its web, Cyclosa octotuberculata offloads some of the burden of cognition to its environment. It expels its current knowledge and memory into a compact yet meaningful physical form, making a mark on the world that can guide its future action. The interacting system of the spider and its web is smarter than the spider could hope to be on its own. This outsourcing of intellect to the environment is known as extended cognition. And now we get to cognitive modeling. When a scientist, mathematician, or engineer writes down an equation, they are expanding their own mental capacity. They are offloading their knowledge of a complicated relationship onto symbols on a page. By writing these symbols down, they leave a trail of their thinking for others and for themselves in the future. Cognitive scientists hypothesize that spiders and other small animals rely on extended cognition because their brains are too limited to do all the complex mental tasks required to thrive in their environment. We are no different. Without tools like mathematics, our ability to, or programming in my case, too dumb for mathematics, our ability to think and act effectively in the world is severely limited. Mathematics makes us better in some of the same ways written language does. But mathematics goes beyond everyday language because it is a language that can do real work. And here, as a language person, I'm going to say, but they have different affordances. They make different kinds of work easier. The mechanics of mathematics, the rules for rearranging, substituting, and expanding its symbols are not arbitrary. They are a systematic way to export the process of thinking to paper or machines. Alfred Whitehead, a revered 20th century mathematician, has been paraphrased as saying the ultimate goal of mathematics is to eliminate any need for intelligent thought. Right? You don't want to have to be clever. You can have the computer be clever for you. And then you can focus on surviving or having fun, right? The funny thing, there's a couple of ironies here in these texts. One is that this is the model of cognition that Grace Lindsay is proposing, right? A model of cognition in which we continuously externalize and internalize processes. That book, which is an amazing book, and I really recommend it, but has not a single model that is not an internalist model. The second irony is that if you read the history of computational thinking and of computers, what the early computer scientists like von Neumann were trying to reproduce with their thinking machines were not what you and I do with our own mind, making decisions in isolation or something like that. They were trying to reproduce the work of the mathematician writing symbols on a whiteboard or blackboard. And if you think of the Turing machine, that's exactly what a Turing machine is. You all know what a Turing machine is, right? But it is the act of writing on a string of paper, infinite string of paper, ones and zeros, which can be manipulated without any internal operation. So that all the cognition is external to the thing performing the cognition, right? But once those computers were created, they became a model for what goes on inside the mind, which I think it's ironic. It's very useful, but it is a very ironic operation. Sorry, this is me. Humanistic background. Okay, so cognitive modeling, we said it's an attempt to develop formalized, that is, mathematic or algorithmic models of our theories of the processes that underlie behaviors. In many cases, most of the computational modeling that you see around and that we will implement are specific models, specific tools that started at least or still want to describe a very specific cognitive process that is learning seen as a process of statistical learning, or a process of reinforcement learning, or memory seen as a process of exponential decay, or decision making as a process of evaluating the risk, the potential loss, and blah blah into prospect theory, or a lot of perception as a process that integrates what you already know, your prior, with what you're receiving from the world, your likelihood. Some of these models that attempt to become a general theory of cognition, let's say Bayesian modelers of cognition, which ironically most often don't even use Bayesian statistics. They see Bayes' theorem, this process of integrating priors and likelihood, as the thing that the brain does. The free energy principle is a fancy version of Bayes' theorem. It aims at describing every cognitive process being free energy principle in the environment in which it is. Then it's also made to describe COVID and molecules and traffic and everything else. But it's a model of how cognition works to start with. Reinforcement learning, a way to model how we infer statistical regularities in the environment, is made to be the basis for a lot of cognition, to the point that if you read papers in a field called computational psychiatry, the attempt at formalized cognitive processes that give rise to clinical symptoms in psychiatric conditions, 95% are about reinforcement learning. Any kind of symptoms and cognitive impairment can be reduced to a difference in how we learn from negative feedback or from positive feedback. So there's going to be a tendency, a temptation to actually take whatever model you're working with and see how far you can stretch it. And that's actually a healthy attitude as long as you're aware that that's what you're trying to do. There's a third kind of models, which is a bit different. We're not really going to cover that, but you should know it's out there. It's called cognitive architectures. There are people like John Anderson. I think you all had the Anderson handbook in Introduction to Cognitive Science, who have been working for a few decades to develop equations that describe different aspects of the cognitive system, from the processing of the stimulus to the storing of this in the different and more stable, progressively more stable forms of memory, to processes of decision making, to processes of motor control that lead to push the button in an experiment, to the point that these sets of equations implemented in the God-cursed language of Lisp can actually be used to run through your experiment. You have artificial participants with equations which parameters have actually been fine-tuned by decades of experiments trying really to get the right value for that parameter. They're actually super fun to play with. You can then extract some of these equations and run your STEM model on that. That's something that we can discuss. But they're not what we're trying to do. We're not trying to build a mathematical model of the human mind in its entirety. What we're going to learn is how do we build on-the-spot models that fit the purpose that we're trying to solve. Good. I think this is actually something that we discussed, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but just very quickly, we are doing cognitive modeling because we supposedly, at this stage or fourth year of cognitive science, know something about cognitive processes. It makes no sense that you're not allowed to use them, or that you can only use them to design the experiment and not to design the analysis. As Bayesians, Bayes' best friend, BBFF, right? We want to use everything that we know and to put it to test. So we don't just want to learn from the data. We want to also put into play what we already know about cognitive processes. Sometimes what we will see is that what we think we know about cognitive processes is very vague and underspecified, and we don't know how to implement it into an equation or into an algorithm. And even when we do that, it's just crap on the data, right? That happens. But that actually means that we get a better idea of what works and what doesn't. That we get a more precise theory of how a specific cognitive process might function. It's harder, it takes longer time than doing verbal theories, but it is a good complement. And I think I gave you the lost chasing example, so I'm not gonna, it's the gambling example, I'm not gonna take it again. And these, what we're gonna do, we'll build a lot on your previous focus on cognitive science, which will give us theories to formalize and build upon. Experimental design, because experimental designs are already some kind of formalization of cognitive theories, and they help us designing different ways in which our algorithm, our formalized model, can play in this task, and therefore set up the most informative context for assessing our hypothesis. It also builds on statistical modeling, because since you're frenemies of Bayes now, you know something about the laws of probability, you know something about Bayesian techniques, and you have an initial, I like the word inchoate, it makes me sound smart. Sorry. Initial understanding, it's a blossoming at the beginning understanding of statistical workflows, which you develop throughout your studies. That is, you're not the kind of student, researcher, scholar, data scientist who just says, "Who t-test," or "Who I've read of these very fancy log norm, or what's called the first one, shifted log normal mixed effect model that I can use to describe reaction times, and I'm just gonna throw it at the data." And who, there's some censoring in the data, like we removed all the long response latencies above 1 second because somebody cleaned the data without telling us. We're just going to put on top some censoring that BRMS allows us to do, right? And then we're going to get some Bayes factor or evidence ratio or Bayesian p-value or whatever, right? You're actually being trained, I hope, since I haven't taught all the courses, but into thinking, well, we first need to simulate some data, see whether the model can actually fit these data, do some power analysis that tell you whether your design is good enough. If you don't feel confident on that, don't worry, we're going to do a lot of that, but you at least know that there are ways not to just use the available tools, but to actually think through what are the conditions to apply them and how to make sure that what you're doing works. And then we'll do it a lot of the time. Lots of the classes will be just making sure that our models work. Okay, so we learn how to think of specific problems and formalize models of how people learn and make decisions in this context. We learn how to code the models to both simulate their implications and assess how well they explain and predict the data. And we'll focus on the modeling process, right? Getting from our intuition of the data generating mechanism onto the computer programming lines of code, more than these are the models available. We will be mentioning and discussing models that are available, but we will really focus on the modeling more than on the models. And here is a funny thing where this is where you've been locked all the time while not knowing. Regressions, t-tests, ANOVAs, correlations, generalized linear mixed effect models. But out there, there is a universe of wild exploration, fun, and bespoke cognitive modeling. Though most of the courses that you see out there in cognitive modeling, they will just make new boxes. But we'll learn how to jump between boxes. Okay. I think I'll do another slide before we do the break. So that's what Bayesian cognitive, that's what cognitive modeling is. Why are we implementing it as a Bayesian workflow, right? So lots of, again, the cognitive modeling that's out there is somebody develops the equation, writes it in, I don't know, in the old days, it was mostly MATLAB, right? And then applies some version of a maximum likelihood approach, or in the earlier days of the least squared errors approach. That is, given the data, if I try a random value for all the different parameters, how big is my error? If I change the parameter values in some direction and I recalculate the errors, is it increasing or decreasing? If it's increasing, I make a step back. If it's decreasing, I keep going in that direction until I reach a point where no matter where I move, I get worse. And there's fancy ways of doing that, but that's the key idea, right? And that worked, right, for 40, 50 years of cognitive modeling. Why are we going Bayesian? Besides, because it's me teaching it. The idea is that as our knowledge on cognitive processes increases, right, over 50 years of mathematical psychology, we actually got to know some things. Also, the complexity of the models that we need to fit increases. And that really taxes methods like maximum likelihood estimation or ordinary least squares, right? Because the more parameters you need to fit, the bigger the space that you need to explore, the longer it takes to exploring it, right? Also, if you have lots of parameters, have you gone through the two legs example in McRit's book? So the idea there is that if you measure people's height and their left leg's length, you get a very good model that from the leg predicts the height. If you do the same with the right leg, it works just as beautifully, right? But if you collect data from 5 people on both their left and right leg, and you fit a model using maximum likelihood, you get that the beta values, the coefficients that allow you to go from the length of leg 1 and the length of leg 2 to the height, have huge uncertainty. Because as long as you know the left leg and the right leg, that information is very correlated, right? People who have a very long right leg, they will also have a very long left leg, right? And people who will have a very short left leg, on average, will also have a very short right leg. So if I put a very small coefficient on the left leg, let's say minus 1,000, I can still predict very nicely the height if I put a plus 1,000 on the other leg. They balance out. And I can go minus 2,000 and plus 2,000, minus 3,000 and plus 3,000, right? The model is underdetermined because there's very different combinations of the parameters of the two coefficients that give exactly the same result. However, right, we're not that stupid, right? We haven't developed enough mathematics to be allowed to be very stupid. And we know that it makes no sense to put a coefficient of minus 1,000, 2,000, 3,000 on a leg to predict the height. People are not negative height the longer their leg is, right? So what Bayes allows us to do is to put constraints on the plausible parameter values. Priors. The more complex the models are, the more important the priors are. Second, as we want to solve things with maximum likelihood, we need to be very clever given the problem that we have we need to find the right optimizer that allows us to solve that specific problem. So when you look at old papers on cognitive modeling, each of them will have their own very specific MATLAB package-like thing that tries to solve that very specific problem. If you change it and you're not analyzing anymore, I don't know, ratings as a linear scale, but ratings as ordinal scales, then the optimizer doesn't work anymore. You need to develop a new one. The kind of Bayesian framework that we use provides a general purpose algorithm, Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, which we'll talk about. I know you want to talk about that. Let's talk about Hamiltonian Monte Carlo, which you give it any equation and it should solve it. It's not specific to any given algorithm. It has limits, it's a human creation, but it's as general purpose as we can get. And third, that the community that is around these kind of Bayesian algorithms has actually developed very good tools to think through the modeling process. They've been really hard at work trying to share with each other and write down what are good ways of making sure that we're not fooling ourselves, that the models that we're building actually do what we think they're doing. And so we can build on their practice, on their culturally evolved system of doing things. Yes, and I think that's a good place to, oh, very last one, that if you went through some of Richard McElreath's Statistical Rethinking book, as I think you have, you've started to think through how that works for regression models. And that means we already have this inchoated understanding of how it will work for cognitive modeling. And once you learn how to do it for cognitive modeling, then it's a really good abstract tool to think through any sort of computational analysis, all the way up to some limits to deep learning and language technologies, because it makes you critical about what are your expectations and what should you expect to see. Good. Now it's time for a 10 minutes break. So we'll do until 3:17. Right. Yes. We'll start. Yes. But
I'm the one who emailed you.
yes.
And I was doing this class as well. Trying
Yeah.
to get it to run. I tried out the link that you sent me. Still can't get it to work.
Okay.
Got time after class.
Not today, but maybe tomorrow. I need to check. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Let's see if we can figure it out tomorrow or the break tomorrow. Yeah. Okay. We should start again. Mm. Oh, I haven't shared the screen. Here, I'm gonna share it. Okay. So since I know that you all burn for research and getting better research skills, but not everybody wants to end up being a researcher, I also started, well, I know several people who moved from cognitive modeling into industry. And I actually asked on Twitter if they could tell you which kind of things they brought from cognitive modeling into their work as data scientists of a kind in the industry, so that at least you have an idea of what people are using out there, not because you have to, but at least you might feel that what you're learning is more motivated by this, beside survival and fun and hanging out with BBFF. Okay, So Jonas Lindelof is somebody who actually, a few of you have had as a censor in some of your exams. He used to be a psychologist here at Aarhus University. He is now working in the robotic industry. And what I ask is, I'd really appreciate a couple of lines by people in industry on how cog modeling is used and look for in industry so the students know it's not just a nerdy researchy thing. Yoda says, cycle time, the time between items on a production line that is the inverse of the production rate, behaves almost exactly like human reaction times. So if you learn and struggle in how to adequately model reaction times and what generates them, then you're well on pace on path to understand how to model production. And if you're a data scientist like Jonas who has to optimize how the different machines are acting on whatever it is that they're producing, because robotics industry is basically mechanical arms that do very boring things. It's not anything fancy. Well, it is very fancy, but it doesn't look very fancy. He says, I use the shifted log normal a lot, interpreting it as a fundamentally multiplicative phenomenon on industrial robotics and manual processes alike. So even without actually going cognitive modeling, learning, as you were saying, I think it was you, how do we go from our intuition, or maybe it was you, our intuition of the model, of the data, into an actual formula with links, or maybe it was you, I can't remember. Sorry, I already, sorry, spoiled my image, it's terrible. That's something that Jonas is using on a daily basis, as is trying to optimize the production line. Christina Van Heer is an Australian data scientist who worked at the COVID center there, and says, not as industry, but I work on a COVID modeling team at the health department in Melbourne, understanding the underlying generative processes which give rise to data. Understanding the underlying generative processes which give rise to data is an underrated skill. I've used hierarchical based a bit, though it can sometimes be hard to sell. And then she adds, just as an assist to the old social and cultural dynamics course, some of the agent-based stuff from cognitive modeling is also super useful to understand, as well as survival analysis. Thinking, survival, it's not very, again, it's something that sounds very fancy. It's not super fancy. It's pretty straightforward once you learn how to do this sort of thinking. But the idea is that thinking about the data generating process is something that it can really help you get a grasp of the phenomenon that you want to model, more than describing contrast. Nathaniel Haynes, who used to be cognitive modeler, ended up working in a company, in a startup that was trying to develop the least effort possible questionnaires and tests to assess well-being in employees, and now actually switched to financial stuff. Says, for me, reinforcement learning, decision theory, and hierarchical Bayes in general have all been super useful, but also things like item response theory using random effects, not only by participant, but also by stimulus. For instance, I've used item response theory a lot for measuring constructs. As you administer questionnaires, this traditional psychological thing, also when you validate these questionnaires, is basically to have an equation that takes the 5 items that belong to negative feelings in depression and put them into a factor, right? Another equation that takes the lack of motivation in doing things in depression and combines them into a score, right? What he's saying here, it says, actually, if you just throw all of the questions that you're asking and you model them separately, or separate in the same model, but as separate random effects, you actually can do a lot more with the data. Reinforcement learning is coming up when I have to come up with ways to think about how behavior relates to mood or pain, again, the data generating process behind the kind of data that it's looking at. But honestly, I think that the biggest thing is that cognitive modeling teaches you how to think generatively about a system and then build a model of that generative process and fit it to real data. To me, that is the most crucial skills rather than a particular model per se. And the last one is Chris Chatham, who used to be a cognitive neuroscientist, then became a research scientist at Roche, then became one of the big administrative people, and now he has started his own startup. It says, I like what everybody else has said, but other examples can be found in the specific conference program. I agree with Nate, hierarchical based, reinforcement learning, item response theory, but also error in variables, mixture models, Gaussian processes are all applied to humans, animal, and portfolio decision making. That is, things that you work on at that time, how do humans behave as you give them different treatment, as animals behave as you give them different treatment, how to make decisions given limited resources about what to invest on as a company are all things where you can apply these techniques. I also agree with Nate Haynes about the general benefits of Bayesian cognitive modeling. Beyond thinking about data generating processes, it also encourages an understanding of evidence as graded, sequential, regularized by prior, and as failing to fully specify decisions wherever utility functions aren't also specified. And here it needs a bit of unfolding. What does this mean? It means that as you run a model, you get an estimate. Right? In the old days, you would get, can we safely reject the null hypothesis? Now we get, hey, maybe these specific disorder condition is impairing or is changing the learning rate from 0.4 to 0.3 with a big cloud of uncertainty, right? What is that telling us? In Bayes, there is something which I've started implementing a bit in this course, but not fully yet because it takes time to figure out how to do it properly. But it's called utility theory, and you've done it in decision making, right? That is, there are costs and benefits of assuming that that difference is meaningful. An example that I used to give in method 3 is if we are using yes. Let's say that you're building a machine learning system that is a very fancy logistic regression to predict whether the patient that you're seeing at the clinic has autism or not. You might look at whether the p-value from the voice, you might look at whether the p-value is significant, right? And you might then publish the paper. Does that mean you should use it? No. You might have an estimate of how much increase in pitch will change the propensity of the person to have autism. Right? Is that enough? Well, it really depends on the consequences of attributing a diagnosis, having a false positive, having a false negative, right? So for instance, it might be as a practitioner, you might say, well, the false negative is a really high cost, right? False negative, we don't attribute or potentially attribute a diagnosis to somebody who would benefit from that, who could use the extra teacher in school, whatever. I'm simplifying. It's more complex than that. There's identity, there's all sort of things. While a false Positive, meaning attributing a diagnosis to somebody who doesn't have the diagnosis, since the diagnosis has to be confirmed over time, and worst case, they get extra support, is not a problem, right? So as long as we maximize the sensitivity of the algorithm, that is, as long as we make sure to capture everybody who might need or use in positive ways that diagnosis, the algorithm should be applied. But if the algorithm has a lot of false negatives, that's a crappy one. And we can put numbers on those costs. While an administrator might take a very different utility function. Right? What the administration might say, we have very limited resources. That biases also all the other judgments. So for instance, right, it might say, well, if you give a diagnosis to a child, the family is going to undergo a lot of stress. So a false positive is actually a big problem. It's not only going to give undue stress to the family and the child, but it will also steal resources from people who actually need that. Right? So that administration will have a very different utility function. And so what the results that we get mean depend on the costs and benefits associated with different decisions. And that's something that traditional statistics doesn't give you. In principle, in Bayesian modeling, you can actually implement it as part of your model. And then there's some stuff you can look at. He just goes on a few different other funny things that you can do. Okay. So I think we've seen that, but I want to guide you through how models of cognitive processes are thought through and built more than a toolbox, provide or reinforce a good Bayesian workflow based on formalizing your algorithm, simulating data, assess your assumption, including what the priors that you're setting mean, do parameter model recovery, that is ensure that the model that produces the data, when fit on the data, actually figures out what were the parameters value. Right? Model recovery, that is, if you have different theories that can produce different models that can produce the data, if you simulate data from the one and the other, and then you do model comparison, can you actually find the true model? In these very rare cases where you actually know that there is a true model amongst those that you have. But also to develop your programming skills and probabilistic programming skills. We'll do some stuff that you might, at least in the previous years, you might only have started doing, like parallel programming. Hopefully it started getting introduced a bit more, but we'll see. And at the end of the course, you should be able to start thinking about how to use your own theoretical knowledge in cognitive science to build your own models, as well as to robustly evaluate existing models and their applicability. Therefore, the portfolio exam looks like this. We'll do a first assignment starting slow, which is tomorrow you will have to play a game with each other. And you will have to describe and motivate a verbal, meaning using words, model of how participants might solve that task and develop a formalization in R that can play the game and produce a behavior. So this first assignment really eases us onto the thing that as we deal with a phenomenon, we delve into it, we try being participant. If it's an experiment, we try talk to the people involved. If it's, let's say, delusions in schizophrenia, because we cannot get ourselves into a TMS and get delusions that way. I'm not sure that would be ethical. And we need to work with our words to sort of capture the intuition of that. And then we need to formalize it to make it as precise as possible. That's the first assignment, due somewhere around week 3. The second assignment, somewhere around week 7. is going to be about taking the formalized model that you produced or one of the formalized models of the other groups. If it sometimes people get very creative and complicated in building these models, and actually use it to analyze empirical data. So not only generate the model, but use it on real data. And that's analyzing data with formal models. Now that you have like all the Bayesian workflow to do these sort of things, in week 10, you will have to submit assignment 3, which is about applying a theory-driven model weighted base that we will discuss during lectures and classes and try it out. But then I will give you a different task than the one we've seen it used. And you will have to adapt it, run the simulation, and fit it to the data. So the idea is that you have some theoretical models in the literature, some computational models that have been developed. How do you turn them to your own purpose and device? And the final assignment in the last week is going to be the alien categorization challenge. We will basically do an assignment that recapitulates everything. You will have to go through a very specific game where aliens will be trying to get you, or you'll have to figure out whether these aliens are dangerous or not. And you will have to discuss your own verbal models based on your intuition and your cognitive science understanding, and formalize it and fit it to the data. And these assignments are designed so that there is a degree 0 safe models to build if you really want to build your own understanding step by step without having to dare too much. But they're also open for people who want to try crazy stuff. Because there's not one model that I want you to fit. There's the safe model, and then you can develop what you want. And failing at making the model work is not necessarily a criterion for failing in the exam, because what I want to learn is the skills. I don't care about the model per se. Passing criterion, basically you will get a markdown or instruction sheet for each assignment, including instructions and a few questions to answer. You will make a GitHub repository with all the code and data that you're going to use. Then separately, you will make a prose answers to the question with the relevant plots with a link to the repository. And you submit the prose answer, because that forces you to abstract away from all the hard coding work and onto how you communicate what you learned. I'll still go and check your GitHub because I'm that sort of nerd. But I want you to separate the two operations, right? Because when you work in a company, they're not going to care about your code. They want the answer. When you work as a researcher, they're going to want to have the nicely wrapped paper. They don't care about the code, most of the people, right? But the code is very important. So we have two things. Do the work, honestly attempt to answer every questions. Those marked as optional are, of course, optional. Even with errors, that's a pass. The internal deadline that I put there before, but we will sort of discuss them week by week, are for you to help you structure your work. The only deadline that matters for passing is the final one. Of course, if you submit by the internal deadline, you get collective feedback. I'm not going to promise individual feedback. I'll see what I can do, but I'm not going to promise it. If you don't, I'm not going to be able to do that, right? But that's fine. You can still talk to your peers. You can still submit. You can still pass. Questions? Yes. Yes. You're adults. I take you as you're motivated to learn. You wouldn't be here otherwise. I see no point in enforcing individual assignments. Yes. Collective is fine. Of course, you need to tell me, because people often shift groups between assignments. You need to tell me who is working on which assignment, right? Yes. There are formal requirements about that, as well as there are formal requirements about the size of groups, which means that you might have to submit separately in two groups if your group is too big. I'm not going to turn on the plagiarism check because it doesn't make sense in these sort of exams. Yes. Yes. Well, so you could also hand in as a group, I think. Yeah. So if you hand it in individually, you bypass all the problems. I think that there are options to hand it in as a group, but if it's not necessary, we don't even need to worry about that. So let's do it individually. So we bypass that issue and we focus on Stan. Okay, how do we get there? Here is a tentative timeline, mostly so that I have enough material ready. I want to really foreground that last year we readjusted some things and people got really stressed because they felt they were behind. And the point is, no, what I want is you to learn. I need to have materials and code prepared in advance, otherwise I don't survive myself. But if we need to expand on some topics, if we need to discuss stuff, if we need to add a completely different model, that's not a problem. This is just scaffolding for the course. So today is why cognitive modeling and why we should care. Tomorrow is going to be the matching pennies game, where you need to play this game and develop verbal models. Next week, we're going to go discuss how do we go from verbal to formal model. And I'm going to also in the lecture provide examples of code on how to do that. The practical exercise is going to be taking some of the variable models that you produced this week and write our code that actually implements that as agents playing the game. Week 3, we'll start working in Stan, and we will be modeling rates in Stan, which is the simplest distribution with one parameter, right? How likely it is that you play right or left. On week 4, we will be discussing how on the skeleton of the Stan code that we have learned to write the week before, we can actually implement the kind of Bayesian workflow that we've talked about with simulation, model quality checks, parameter recovery, blah, blah, blah. Week 5, we will be discussing multi-level modeling. What does it mean not to rely on BRMS to do the dirty work for you? How do we implement pooling together in Stan? And then the practical exercise might be finishing up the previous practical exercise. And for those of you who are already beyond that, implementing the multi-level models. Multi-level models are not going to be a requirement for any of the assignments. That's something that I want you to learn how to do, but I don't want you to despair over that. Week 6, we're going to do model comparison, comparing different formal models of the same process on the data. Week 7, we're going to take a step back, and instead of starting from a task and trying to develop ad hoc models that would work for that specific task, we're going to start from Bayesian models of cognition. That is not models that are fitted using Bayes, but models that implement some version of the Bayes theorem to describe cognitive processes. We're going to talk about information integration. That is the process that integrates two or more sources of information, which might be your expectation and what comes from the word, or it could be your experience of your word and what your best friend Mina is telling you, and so on and so forth. Just a general model of how we take different sources of information and integrate them together, sight and hearing, whatever. And that's going to take a few weeks because we need to sort of go through the theory, go through the equation, implement it, simulate the data, blah, blah, blah. On April 3rd, there's probably not going to be any lecture because I have a conference, but I'm trying to figure out whether you can have an optional module that's completely online or whether I'm going to have somebody who works on fancy models of information integration, the hierarchical Gaussian filter, coming and talking about that. Then we will move on to categorization models. Are you working on? No. Do you hate the AGF? Yeah, we will see what it is. We will not implement it in Stan because it would require several weeks on its own. But we will see. I can also share some code that implements it in Stan. It's basically a fancy reinforcement learning. I told that. I'm not streaming live and recording this. And then what happens at the end, it really depends on the specific class. Sometimes we finish up previous work. Sometimes we take a new completely model and I, on the black whiteboard together with you, sort of very quickly formalize it and develop it. Or it could be all the stuff that you're still hanging with. Good. Does this make sense as a structure? I have lots of additional materials. I also have no problem cutting some of the material, right? So it really depends on what works for this group. There's readings in the syllabus. Another thing that I want to really foreground is I don't expect you to come to the lectures having read and fully understood the readings. The readings are a resource for you. A lot of the stuff that I say, sometimes I get sidetracked by some questions, or I need to just give you really the core of that notion. And I want you to have references to go back if you're feeling a bit shaky, if you want to learn more, even at a later stage, you need to use that specific concept so that you can go and read. Sometimes there is a really long paper on the Bayesian workflow that sort of tries to put it all in. I don't expect you to read it from 1 week to the other or from 1 week to 2 weeks after, right? But it's your reference thing. Sometimes you're going to have some videos on some American dude, going through how to code in Stan, because sometimes the way I explain Stan, right, might not resonate with you. And of course, I want to question and clarify. Sometimes it's actually nice to go and see this other person who explains it and then see, oh, actually, Ricardo explains it so much better. Right? No, but that's the general gist, right? What you really will be spending lots of time, all the time that is allocated for the course, is going to be on the assignments. That's really where a lot of the learning is. So when you do the evaluation, don't come back to me and say, the readings weren't covered in the classes, because that's not the point, right? The readings are there as extra resources. The lectures present modeling techniques and models, hopefully with a bit of discussion. All the lectures are recorded and shared and streamed. The classes are really about working in groups through the portfolio assignments. I know in some courses it's useful to do portfolio, some exercises, portfolio, some exercises. There's a lot to do in these modeling assignments, and I want us to work through that together, and I've used all the time that we can for that. Mostly they follow up what we discussed during the lecture. I will also, there's no technique that is mandatory that we haven't discussed. Another common issue that gets brought up is not everybody in the groups need to code to pass the exam, because I don't check on who is coding, who is not coding, and some people are worried about free writing. So I'm going to stress that it's very, very important for everybody to code and experiment. We're all adults. If there are issues, let's talk together. If you feel stuck, and therefore it would be easier to sit back and let somebody else solve that issue, and then that snowballs into not being able to code and feeling more into doing the plots and writing, right? Let's talk about that. Let's take the problem early on. Okay. It doesn't work recording the classes. So even if I tried the first year, since it's mostly you working in groups, me running around, and then every now and then taking the key points on the whiteboard, it just doesn't work recording it. This is something that Richard McAreath says. Right? If you are confused, it is only because you are trying to understand. That's normal to be confused. There's no bad question, no stupid question. Ask in class and lectures, especially via email, but also there is an anonymous Google Doc that's linked on Brightspace. People in previous years have found it very useful also to ask very basic questions that they would call stupid without losing face. Use it, right? I'm gonna check it pseudo regularly and answer questions or take them up in class. I've been told that my ability to really capture what was asked varies according to how busy I am throughout the semester, which is fair enough. I think the first year that I was teaching this, I was rocking my kid. I was answering questions. If the answer is not on point, comment on it. Right. If you put the comment, your name comes in. So answer below it if you want to keep anonymity. Right. Just let me know that I didn't get the answer, or that I didn't answer your question. Right. Programming will be programming in R, because we could do this course in Python and Stan. I'm just better at R because I started in R. If you really want to do it in Python, you can do it in Python. My ability to support you will be lower. There's some resources there because I know that we have students who haven't taken the bachelor. So refresher for R and R Studio. There's the second edition of the R for data science there. Refresher for Bayesian statistics, and we'll take up again all the different key concepts. I've linked in the Prep Your Brain very short version of the methods for course that Chris Cox and me sort of teach as a PhD course. There's also the amazing McAfee Statistical Rethinking online video course that now is actually based on the third yet unpublished edition of the book, which has much more about the Bayesian workflow. Yeah, that's basically, we're going to use R and Stan, and I will try to go slow and explain a lot during lectures. I always mix those up. Lectures and take up problems on the whiteboard during classes, but peer support is going to be key, and you asking questions is going to be key. uCloud, I'm not going to teach uCloud, but I created a uCloud instance with credits for you to run things. I usually run things on my computer, since I could get a very fancy computer, till I am 100% sure everything runs nicely. So I also set up the course to be run mostly from your computer. But we have a uCloud project that you are free to use, especially for the slower models or the heavier simulation. Send me an email with your uCloud ID because I had to add you manually. For whatever reason, they cannot provide the full class there. I'm still learning with uCloud, so probably some of you will be better than me at providing support for technical issues with uCloud. One of the issues is that you need to, well, actually, last year you needed to reinstall Stan every time you started an instance. I think they're working on a solution, but I'm not sure it's completely there. I'll be trying to see if I can do it. Bunch of additional reference book. Models of the Mind is fantastic. It's a very discursive introduction to how different mathematical models for cognitive processes and neural processes have been developed. The Farrell and Lewandowski book, Computational Modeling of Cognition and Behavior, is also a very good resource. Very pedagogical, goes through a lot of things. The annoying thing is that if you're interested in a specific cognitive model, it's integrated in whatever the book is trying to explain at that point. Let's say maximum likelihood. So you need to read a lot of maximum likelihood stuff to understand reinforcement learning. I can't remember what they explained there. There is the Lee and Wagenmaker's book called Bayesian and Cognitive Modeling, which is a fantastic cookbook for cognitive models in JAGs. But I also done a recoding instead of most of the models when I was trying to learn enough to teach this course a few years ago. There is a book by Bruno Nissenbaum and colleagues, An Introduction to Bayesian Data Analysis for Cognitive Science, which is freely available online. Also has some very pedagogical explanations of different notions that we're gonna discuss. Leave one out of sample error estimation and blah, blah, blah. There is a book which is a very different approach to computational modeling from a logical perspective called Theoretical Modeling for Cognitive Science Psychology. There is a book by the Stanford people. Noah Goodman is, I don't remember if he's still that, but he used to, when I visited him, he used to be the chief of data science at Uber. And he wandered around the Stanford psychology department with this linen tunic and bare feet and long hair and like this aura of light. He was super sharp. These annoying people. That's also an interesting, it's a very different way of approaching cognitive modeling, assuming that all cognitive processes are about reconstructing distributions in the environment. And that's the kind of things that they present. And then there is a very tough book on Bayes analyzing all sort of very fun thing called Bayesian Data Analysis by Gelman and colleagues, the 3rd edition. Bunch of online materials. Again, I just want you to have this stuff available because you might need it at a certain point. There's a course in computational psychiatry applying cognitive modeling to understanding psychiatric conditions, which is online there. There's a course on network models to psychological data, that's there. There's a cognitive modeling course that is not too dissimilar from this, but only focused on reinforcement learning, that's there. There's a course on Bayesian psychometric, measurement error, mostly, that's there. And there's a list of cognitive models implemented in BRMS there. Okay, questions? Are you sold? So now I can only fall, right? Good. So last time I checked, I don't think I checked last night, but last time I checked, there were still no questions about Bayesian stuff in the Google Doc. If you have questions, leave them there so I have something to start with in covering your doubts. Right. Next time, we will take a bit of time to actually go through a very sketchy setup of, sketchy in not fully detailed, setup of how the Bayesian analysis works. But really, I expect you to have watched if you don't remember stuff from methods 4, to have watched the very short few video lectures that Chris and me prepared, which should give you most of the template, and then I will mostly focus on samplers on the whiteboard before going into verbal models and formal models. Does that make sense? Good. Yes. More questions? Nothing. Good. Then I'll see you tomorrow. I think, oh, sorry, very last thing. Sometimes the lectures jump between Wednesday and Thursday because they overlap with other stuff that you need to do, or that some of you who are RA need to do, or that the department needs to do. I ensure that at least when we have lectures on Wednesday, it's always in the same room, because we had a different room every time. But keep an eye on the timetable so not to make mistakes on when one class is. I think next week is already on Wednesday.